There we go, that's more like it. I'm the right way round, which is always a help. Good evening, everyone. I hope you've all found me again, now that I've decided to be the right way up. There we go. Welcome back to take 2. There we go. Now I'm the right way up. This always helps. Hello, Laurie. Hello, Sue. Good afternoon to you. Good evening. Hello, Sarah. Hello, Diane. And hello, Tricia. Welcome to you all. I hope that you appreciate the sentiment that I've displayed on the computer screen here. Hello, Ursula. Good evening to you. Now, as you've probably guessed, this is an at-home tour, so I'm not walking the streets of London. I've decided to do things the easy way. Hello, Kelly. Good evening to you. Hello, Natasha. Welcome to everyone that's joining us. Oh, we've got 13. Oh, that's bad luck. Sorry, I can't say anything until we've moved on. Otherwise, something terrible will happen. I might get the orientation wrong. Oh no, we've got 12, 13. It's changing all the time. But what I really want is more. Oh, there we go. We've moved on. Hello, Janice. Good evening to you. I was just worried that we might stick at 13, which would obviously be terrible because of my inherent triskaidekaphobia, which is a mortal fear of the number 13. But luckily we've moved on. And we've now got 15, 14. It's going up, it's going down. It's a bit like the stock exchange. It's very exciting. So I have got the orientation right, which is always a good start. And I hope that you appreciate the sentiment that I'm showing here on the computer screen. If there's no bloodlet. Exactly, Diane. If you're not willing to kill each other over a board game, then what's the point in playing? Not that I'm competitive in any way, as you've probably worked out. So let me give you a different perspective. Good evening. Welcome. As you can see, it's rather warm. I'm actually sweating. It's almost like summer out there. Hello, Dawn. I'm just talking about the weather, which is unseasonably warm. I know it's June, but it's still unseasonably warm. And it's really been quite a lovely day today. You have Jaws Monopoly. I love that. Jaws Monopoly. I'm not quite sure how that works. I would love to play Jaws Monopoly. I've got Brighton and Hove Monopoly, which is about the craziest I get. But as we'll see, there are many more far crazier versions of Monopoly itself. Jaws Monopoly. I like that. So no swimming will be no parking. So as you can see, I'm in the comfort and security of my own home, and I'm doing a virtual tour. And the reason that is that if I did this tour live, it would take several days, because I'm going to show you all around London. Well, all around the London that's on the Monopoly board anyway, which will probably take at least an hour. But it means that I'm going to do an awful lot of talking, even more talking than I normally do, which is really quite a fair amount. So what I'm going to be doing is taking you around the board using slides, using Google, using PowerPoint, using pictures and historical pictures and maps to kind of guide you around the London version of Monopoly. And as we'll find out, there are many more, hundreds of versions of this game. Now, I'm quite surprised to see that when I posted the recent link to this, that there are still people who are adding angry emoticons. And that's because Natalie, one of our top guides obviously, the Queen of London, Natalie also does Monopoly tours, but they're a little different to mine, as you're about to find out. But people don't really see that. They just think that I'm, I don't know, stepping on her turf or something like that, which I can assure you I'm not. I had this idea 2.5 years ago. So long before COVID, long before I even discovered Hago, I came up with this idea of taking people round the Monopoly board square by square. And that's what I'm doing tonight. So apologies to anyone who might be angry about that, thinking that I've nicked Natalie's idea, but I haven't. Thank you, Sarah. Don't worry what they say. I did chuckle when I saw it, because I think it's actually the same people that are expressing disapproval. And yeah, what can you do? They need to grow up and stop moaning. Well, there we go. That's what they need to do. Exactly, Mandy. Hello, Joy. Good evening to you. Michelle, yeah, I do kind of agree. It is rather ridiculous. It's not like anyone's got a monopoly on, what's the name? Monopoly. Yeah, that's it. It's not like anyone's got a monopoly on Monopoly. Because if they had that, that would be ridiculous. You would probably need an anti-monopolies commission to look into that and make sure there was no monopolising of Monopoly. You can tell already at this early stage, hello Tariq, you can tell how many times I'm going to mention the word Monopoly during this tour, which is quite a few. Hello Bonnie, can I have the boot please? Now they have changed the players' icons, the pieces that go around the board. And one of the things they've changed, interestingly enough, is the iron. So in modern Monopoly, there is no iron. And that's because it was considered sexist, because it was assumed that women would choose this piece because they were the ones that did all the ironing. But I can tell you as a man that I also do ironing, and I quite enjoy it. You like to be the little dog. That's good. You've got the Brighton. Exactly, Bonnie. I've got that as well, because I used to live in Brighton. So I've got the Brighton and Hove Monopoly, and it's really quite exciting. And of course, as we'll find out, there are many hundreds of different varieties of Monopoly game all around us. You love the car and the top hat. Oh yes, so do I. Gives an air of class to the whole game. So welcome to everyone that's joining us. We've still got 7 minutes to go, but we are now officially going live. And as we're officially going live, what I'm also going to do is post a link. And that's where you can tip me for this tour and buy me a coffee. Hopefully that will show up on your screens fairly soon. Now, it may not be a clickable link if you're looking at this on your mobile, but I think if you're looking at it on your PC, it will be. And if you're looking at it on the mobile, you need to look on the comments afterwards and you will see it come up as a clickable link. So we've still got about 6 minutes to go. And I will be talking an awful lot. I know I normally talk a lot, but tonight I'm going to talk an extreme amount, and that's because my challenge is to take you round the London Monopoly board in about an hour, possibly a little bit more. I hope you have no plans for the rest of the evening, because it might take a little while to guide you around the board, because we're going square by square around the London Monopoly board. You're seeing it on your mobile. That's good, Sarah. That's a good start. Hello, Penny. Good evening to you. So as you can see, we're in the comfort and security of my own home. You're going to buy me a coffee. That's good. As you can probably tell, I've already had several coffees, which I thought I might need in order to motivate me through this marathon tour, because we're going all around the Monopoly boards talking about every individual square, even the go to jail square. So, you know, it's... Am I doing all the squares tonight, Sandra? Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I will not miss out a square. And there will be parliamentary references. There may also be scaffolding at some point. Wow. So, yes, I think that this is quite a marathon tour. This is a test of my memory and endurance, to see if I can guide you around the board square by square, telling you a little about... It sounds ambitious. Don't worry, I can do it. I can do it. I've done it before. So I designed this tour, by the way, well over 2.5 years ago. So long before I discovered Heygo, and just before COVID, which was quite useful. And some people have registered their discontent with this on Facebook, and they think that I'm copying Natalie's tours. And Natalie, of course, as you might know, also does Monopoly-based tours around London. But she goes to the locations, and that's decided by a roll of the dice, and she talks about the property prices and the basic history. But what I intend to do is to take you around the whole board, square by square. The London version, of course. There are many other versions, as we will discover. But the one I remember playing, of course, is the London version. I later bought a Brighton and Hove version because that's where I lived at the time. But Monopoly has expanded, and we'll see how it's expanded, and we'll talk about the history of the game as well, and how it's become this all-consuming entity. And we will do that in about 2 minutes. So we've got 2 minutes to go until we start. And then I've got just over an hour to speed guide you through the history of Monopoly, and also to take you square by square all around the building, all around the building, all around the city, showing you each area in a little bit of detail. Hello, Jennifer Tracy Hilton. Good evening to you. And hello, Mark. You found me. I'm not on the calendar. I'm sorry, Mark. You're right. I'm not. And I do try and put some of my tours on the calendar, but it's quite time consuming, and I work on average possibly around 12 hours a day. So I find I've got very little time at the end of that to do all the admin that's necessary. So sadly, I can't post all of my tours on the calendar. I think it's going to be made a little bit easier, so that I will be able to copy and paste onto the calendar on Live Virtually, See the World. I am a busy man, and I've been working all day. I've already done 3 tours today. Tours of Parliament, of course, which I might possibly mention at some point during this tour. There may be a parliamentary reference included. I'm not guaranteeing it, but there could be. But yes, I am a very busy man. But I've done 3 tours already, which means I'm nicely warmed up to give you this marathon tour around the London Monopoly board in about 1 minute's time. Never. What's never? I'm not sure what you mean by never, Mark. Never, nevermore, quoth the raven, nevermore. Bonnie Holland, are we playing Parliament Bingo? It's not quite Parliament Bingo, Bonnie, because it's not the same as Natalie's tours, which is a point I've possibly mentioned earlier. So instead we're going square by square all around the board, and that means that I control the dice. Nobody else gets a look in, and that of course means that I will win, which is fine by me. Hello, Arlene. Good evening to you. We're just about to start our epic journey around the London Monopoly board. In fact, I think we're ready pretty much to go. So welcome. Hello, Gerard. Oh, I'm nervous now. We've got a top guy, Gerard, who's going to be watching my every word. That's good. I like that. Hi, Gerard. How are you doing? We're going to take you tonight on a virtual tour of Monopoly. Now, some people apparently have got rather upset about this, about the whole idea of me copying Natalie's tours. Just to reassure you, I'm not copying Natalie's tours. I developed this tour a long time ago, before COVID, before Hego, and I had the same idea. And that's the thing, you see, that often tour guides will have similar ideas, and that's fine. So my idea was to guide people square by square around the Monopoly board. And of course, this was the beginning of COVID, so it seemed quite a good time to do that. So, we're going to begin that journey with a quote. If you're not prepared to lose every friend you have over a board game, you're not playing hard enough. And I like that quote. And I think it kind of reflects the whole ethos of board games, is that you want to win. That's what it's all about, of course. Hello, Pamela. Now, I remember playing Monopoly when I was young, and when I had my own children, I played it with them. And of course, Monopoly is one of those games that you need to set aside several hours, possibly days, in order to play. And that's because it takes a long time. So you might start the game at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and you find that by the time you finish, it's 9:15, and actually you still haven't finished, you're still playing. It's one of those games that goes on interminably long. And by the time that the game is nearly finished at 9:15, you have a scenario that looks a bit like this. One of the players will have fallen asleep, usually the elder person in the family. One of the players will be pulling their hair out in frustration, having not managed to capitalise on any of their opportunities. One of the players will just have lost interest completely and left the game. And of course, one clever bugger will have made all the money. And they'll be quite glib and self-satisfied. So they'll be the only one that really actually cares about the game at that point. Everyone else, for different reasons, will have lost interest. That sounded rather cynical, but that, I'm afraid, is my enduring memory of the game of Monopoly. That's you. There we are. Dawn also has the same memories. But Monopoly was designed as something completely different. And Monopoly nowadays is a perfect example of capitalism. That's what it's all about. One person screwing over everybody else in the game to end up with all the money. But that's not the way it was meant to be. When the game was designed in 1903, it was designed very differently. Hello, Sandra. You can't see him either. Who can't you see? Is it me that you can't see? That's possibly because my camera is pointing the other way. I'm intrigued. Your hubby still moans that I didn't... Oh, you can't see Gerard. He is there, or he was there. He definitely popped up. He may have popped out again. So when the game was designed in 1903, the idea of Monopoly was very different. So it was designed in 1903 by Lizzie Meiji, an American. And she was a feminist, a politician, part of the suffragette movement. She was incredibly active in various fields. She was also an author. And she came up with an idea for a game. She was also a games designer, one of her many skills. And in 1903, she came up with the idea for a board game. And this board game was based on what she called Georgism. Georgism was a movement in the early 20th century. And what it was based on the ideas of a man called Henry George. And he had an idea for the single tax. You can see it here on the right-hand side. And this was a rebellion against the tax system at the time. So this promotional poster, hello Catherine, says the tax system of today binds people. The single tax will unbind by breaking land monopoly. So that was the idea. The idea was that by imposing a single tax, it would force landlords, who often owned huge tracts of property, to all contribute a greater amount towards the taxation system. And that in turn would make it much cheaper for people to get rents in those areas. So this was her idea, a groundbreaking idea that came from this economist called Henry George. So she decided to base a board game around that principle, and it was meant to be an educational tool. Now you could play this board game in two ways. Here's the original board. And let me see if I can focus this in a little. Hopefully I can. Let's see if my zooming skills work. There we go. So what you can see in the middle is the original Monopoly. But it wasn't called Monopoly. It was called The Landlord's Game. And the idea was that you could play it in two ways. You could either play it as a capitalist, and in that case you would be trying to make as much money as possible, or you could play it in a more liberal way, and you would share the money out between the players. It does look complicated, but it's pretty similar to the modern Monopoly boards that we know and love. And I'll show you how it's similar. So you can see there are similar squares around the board. In the place of going to jail, we have going to the poorhouse, going to the workhouse. So this was one option that you might land on. You might go to the workhouse, and that was obviously not a good position to be in. You might encroach on somebody else's land. You can see over here, this square belongs to Lord Blueblood. This is actually Central Park, and it belongs to an English aristocrat. And if you landed on here, you would have to pay exorbitant taxes. If you landed on these squares on the bottom, you could go to jail. But going to jail was seen as not really that bad an idea, because at least you would get room and board. You would get someone to give you a meal every day. You would have somewhere to shelter. So jail was, in this game, seen as an option that might be better than starving to death out on the streets. And on the other side, you could contribute to the economy. You could get a job, you could pay taxes, and you could work for the betterment of the whole nation as well. Mark, the nationality of the inventor, was American. So yeah, it was an American idea. But the version I remember, of course, is the version from London. It started off as an American idea, and let me go back to the inventor, Lizzie Meiji. So she invented it as this educational game. But unfortunately, she wasn't so good at marketing as she was at inventing games. And eventually, the game would be taken on by a man called Charles Darrow. And he bought the right to that game for a ridiculously cheap amount. And then it would be sold to Parker Brothers. Parker Brothers, the board game company, the entertainment company in America, would buy the rights to this game. And they created this, the modern version of Monopoly. And what they did was dispensed with the more liberal version of the game that encouraged people to be educated about the single tax system. And instead, they went for the capitalist version of the game, where the idea was that you would just go around the board making as much money as possible. So this was the new version of the game, and this would take on big time, and this became wildly successful. Now I'm also going to post along the way various links, And these links show you how you can tip me using Buy Me a Coffee. So I'm going to be posting them along the way. Lizzie Meiji eventually got the recognition that she deserved. But it wasn't for a long time. And it wasn't until 40 years or so after she'd invented the game that she finally got the recognition she deserved, and she was credited with the invention of Monopoly. She didn't make much money out of it at all. But she was eventually given the credit for inventing the game in the first place. But for most people, they remember it as a Parker Brothers game. Nowadays, of course, Monopoly has diversified into all sorts of different versions. And I was told earlier that there is a Jaws version of Monopoly. I'm not quite sure how that works, whether the shark eats you at the end. But as you can see, you've got Game of Thrones Monopoly, Superman Monopoly, The Office Monopoly, The Walking Dead Monopoly, the list goes on. SpongeBob SquarePants Monopoly, Looney Tunes Monopoly, the Smurfs Monopoly. You see, it really is a test of how many times I can say Monopoly without losing my mind. So all of these different versions of Monopoly have expanded. Exactly, she was the inventor. She was the inventor of... I know what you mean. She was the inventor of Monopoly, and she went for a large portion of her life unrecognised. Cluedo was more your game. Star Wars Monopoly. I like the modern versions of Monopoly where you have a credit card instead of cash, and you simply insert your credit card into a card reader. Chocolate Monopoly. I like that. There must be over 100 versions of Monopoly, and they seem to keep inventing new ones every year, normally in time for Christmas. But the one that I remember, You Were Always the Dog, what was I? I can't remember which I liked the most. I think it was the racing car. Now, as I mentioned earlier, they have changed some of these icons, and the reason they've changed them is political correctness. So, for example, they've got rid of the iron, because the iron is considered too sexist, because it's kind of assuming that women do the ironing. That was the idea. Yeah, I know. But the version of Monopoly that I remember is this one, the London version. Eventually, Monopoly crossed the Atlantic and arrived in Britain in the 1930s. And of course, they made a London version of the game. Exactly, Ziggy, I agree. It is a bit of a stretch. And here is that London version of the Monopoly game. And this is what I'm going to do in the next 55 minutes, possibly, maybe a bit longer, but I'm going to take you square by square around the Monopoly board. Now, obviously, this is not going to be a cooperative effort. Nobody else gets a look in, and that means that I can choose my icon. And I choose the dog. I like the dog. I'm going to take the dog for a walk, and I'm going to take you along with it. And we're going to go around every square on the Monopoly board, and I'm going to tell you something about that area. Because certainly when I was young, having never experienced the joys of London before, I was always a bit curious about what these places actually looked like. You like the shoe. I like the shoe too. The boot, I think it was known as. Hello, Jeanette. We're just about to set off on our journey. We're travelling around the London Monopoly board, and I'm going to take you square by square around each and every square of the board. A narrow boat. I like that. A narrow boat. That's a good one. And the first place that we're going to visit is the Old Kent Road. Now, along the way, I'm going to show you the 1970s version that I played. And this gives you the rent underneath the name. And as you can see, this was pretty cheap at the time, £60 to buy a house on the Old Kent Road. Old Tariq, they do it very cleverly with the credit cards. It kind of keeps track of what money you've got. It's all quite clever. They have skyscrapers instead of streets. So they have Canary Wharf, for instance. So the first stop we're going to is Old Kent Road. And this is what Old Kent Road looks like now. But as the name suggests, it really is an old road. Very old. And many things have happened there. So many things have happened there that they've been memorialised in the subways that lead under the main road at Old Kent Road. And you can find these murals that lead under some of these subways. And they tell the story of many of the famous events that have taken place here. For example, on the left, you can see Geoffrey Chaucer setting out in the 12th century, the Canterbury Tales. He's there with his group of pilgrims, and they're going along the Old Kent Road. Rather slowly, as you can see by the inscription above. It says that they leave London and they make their way slowly down the Old Kent Road and eventually stop at a pub, which I think features quite a lot in the Canterbury Tales. On the right, you can see a rebellion taking place, a rebellion featuring a man called Jack Cade, who led one of many peasants' rebellions against London in the 15th century. And Old Kent Road is the road that he came down when he led his band of peasants in open revolt against the king. Talking of kings, on the left you can see King Charles II. He made a glorious return back to England, back to Britain. And this was after he'd been expelled from the country. He'd escaped to France. Oliver Cromwell had been in control, but Oliver Cromwell eventually died, and his son Thomas Cromwell also died, and eventually King Charles II came back, the Merry Monarch. And Old Kent Road was the road that he came down on his grand procession into the city of London. Now, the Old Kent Road is in the East End of London, and one of the great East End traditions of London is all about the Pearly King and Queen. They're called the Pearly King and Queen because they dress up in all sorts of costumes adorned with mother of pearl. And there's an East End Queen, the Pearly Queen, and also an East End King. And they come from different areas of East London, and they often have rather good-natured competitions. So these are the Cockney King and Queen, the Pearly King and Queen of London. Old Kent Road itself is famous for many reasons. One of the reasons is that it used to be full of factories and warehouses. And one of these factories that was demolished in the 1930s contained the factory for R. White's Lemonade. Now this is a little cultural phenomenon. Are the Pearly Kings and Queens still around? They are indeed, and every year they have a grand procession. The Pearly Kings and Queens compete to see who can be the pearliest, and they have a little procession that goes through London. West Ham is celebrating near there tonight. There we are. Thank you, Bonnie. Ah, Ziggy, you've got it. You see, this factory that made R. White's Lemonade became very famous, and it became famous because of a series of adverts. The first of these adverts was in the 1980s. And because I love this advert, it's one of these things that stays with you. I'm going to show you what it was. This is an advert from the early 1980s for R. White's Lemonade. You'll remember this long after you've seen it. Here's the one, Mark.
I'm a secret lemonade drinker. R. White's. I've been trying to give it up, but it's one of those nights. R. White's lemonade. I'm a secret lemonade drinker. R. White's lemonade.
love it. Ah, White's Lemonade. So this was a 1980s advert, and it made Our White's Lemonade very famous because of that advert. It's a classic advert. So that's the Old Kent Road. Let's move on. The Old Kent Road would be demolished in the 1930s. All of the factories, all of the industry would be taken down and demolished, and in its place would be the modern version of Old Kent Road that we see today. The man in the advert was Elvis Costello's dad. I love that fact. I didn't know it, but now I do. How very exciting. Thank you very much, Penny. So that's the Old Kent Road. But we're moving on to another of the Browns. Now, of course, the Browns are generally regarded as the cheapest set on the Monopoly board. And they're the ones that are cheapest to buy. You can see that here. The rent for Whitechapel Road in the 1980s was just £1. That was it. That was all it would take. If you wanted to build on it with one house, it would be £20. And a hotel was only £450. So, the Browns were a set that really didn't matter that much. Now, Whitechapel Road, unfortunately, hasn't changed a great deal. Although it's right next to the City of London, the financial heart of the city, it's still in the area of contrasting poverty. This is what it looks like now. And you can see the shining buildings of the financial district right in front of you. And this is an entryway into that financial district. It's called Whitechapel because, believe it or not, there was a chapel there that was white. Strange, I know. So there used to be an old Malthusian chapel, Carthusian, the White Monks as they were known, and they had a white chapel in this area in the 13th century. Hello, Karen. Reudinger Manteuffel. I do like saying different names. Karen Reudinger Manteuffel. I hope I pronounced it correctly. There was a white chapel here in medieval times, and that's why it got its name. And it was, as you can see, out in the countryside. But eventually buildings started to spring up around the developing financial heart of the city. Hello, Peter. And the Whitechapel was demolished, it was got rid of, and in its place was the London Hospital, one of the biggest and one of the first buildings to be built on this site. And that's why you can see in this picture from the 18th century, the development of Old Whitechapel. One of the things that helped that development was the introduction of the railways. And one of the first underground lines to be laid, and also one of the first points on the National Railway, was here at Whitechapel. So this became a very important rail junction for many people. As you can see here, this is the original Whitechapel underground station. But Whitechapel itself, being in the East End of London, became a very poor, a very deprived district, and it would remain that way for a long time. Now, apparently, that's true of all the East End districts of European cities, and the reason is that in most places the wind blows from the west to the east. So any pollution that's in the city itself will be blown towards the east end of that city. So it's the same in Paris, it's the same in Brussels, same in many European towns. The East End is usually the least desirable part to live in any city. And that's certainly true of London. So the East End of London became a place of extreme poverty, destitution, as you can see in some of these pictures. You can also see it here in some of the maps made by a man called William Booth, a political campaigner at the time, a campaigner that was involved in Chartism, the idea of social movement, social renovation. And he decided to publish a series of maps and they're known as the poverty maps. And they show the most deprived areas of the city. And what you can see is a close-up on the area round Whitechapel. The red areas are the places where middle-class people live, around the main roads. But all around those main roads you can see areas of black. And the black spots were the areas of worst poverty, the areas where people had no jobs and no money and no food. So this was a very deprived area of London. But it's got a long and rich history, despite its impoverished beginnings. And you can see that on one of these huge murals on one of the great buildings that line the main road. Many people, many famous people, have been associated with Whitechapel. For instance, here, having rather a headache, is Vladimir Lenin. Lenin came to London to spread his communist ideals, to spread his ideas of revolution, and he stayed for a short time in Whitechapel. This was where he had one of his great meetings that was meant to spread the revolution around Europe. There was also a man called William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army. He also lived in Whitechapel, and this is where he started his foundation for helping poor people all around the city. Admiral Horatio Nelson lived here and trained nearby in order to beat the French at their own game. So lots of famous people have come here. This is the Kray twins, the East End gangsters that ruled London in the 1950s. And they would eventually end up being imprisoned in the Tower of London. So those are the Kray twins that were ruled by terror in Whitechapel. Over here you can see the Elephant Man, Joseph Merrick. And he's talking to Vladimir Stalin. So Stalin also came and lived for a short time when he was young in London, in the Whitechapel area. And he's talking to the man in the mask, Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. Whitechapel is famous for several reasons. One of them, of course, is Jack the Ripper. And there is numerous Jack the Ripper tours that take place almost every night around the Whitechapel area. But it's also famous as being the place where Joseph Merrick, also known as the Elephant Man, was taken into care, if you like. He was taken to the Royal London Hospital, one of the first buildings to be built in this area. And he was seen by a doctor called Frederick Treves. He was part of a freak show at the time. And Frederick Treves took personal interest in Joseph Merrick. Joseph Merrick had a very rare genetic condition, and this caused him to have all these deformities all over his body, and he'd been displayed as a freak for many years. In 1862, displayed as the Elephant Man. The story went that his mother had been frightened by an elephant, and because of that he'd developed this hideous condition. He was, The Elephant Man is a brilliant film, a brilliant black and white film by David Lynch, which tells the story in an incredible way. So he was taken to the Royal London Hospital, and he was cared for by Frederick Treves. And eventually his story was known all over the world. But Whitechapel is famous for a much more sinister reason. There's a pub there called the 10 Bells, and this was meant to be the meeting place, the drinking place for one of the many victims of Jack the Ripper. In fact, if you go into the 10 Bells, you'll find all sorts of Ripper-based mythology all around the pub. Jack the Ripper, of course, stalked the streets of Whitechapel in 1888. In September of that year, he started his killing spree, if indeed he was one person. Many people think that he may have been a composite, several killers that all had the same idea. But one of his first victims was Polly Nichols, and Polly Nichols drank in the 10 Bells pub. So Jack the Ripper, of course, would begin a reign of terror, the most infamous serial killer in London. And that included letters to the press, including the one on the right-hand side, known as the From Hell letter, written apparently in his victim's blood. Now, because of that, there's a whole tourist industry that goes on in Whitechapel. Whitechapel has many, many tours that leave every night and go around the area telling the story of Jack the Ripper. And it's also led to some incredibly bad puns, as you can see here. They've taken the opportunity to expand on the Jack the Ripper theme, so you have a fish and chip shop called Jack the Chipper. Yes, of course. And you have a hairdresser's called Jack the Clipper. Yeah, those puns are terrible, I know. There's also a furniture repair shop called Jack the Stripper, which is even better. Oh yes, Natalie Kerrio does amazing tours all about the victims of Jack the Ripper, focusing not just on the murders, but also on the victims themselves and what led them to be there in the first place. So there we go. We've moved on from the Browns. We're moving up through the board and we've come to the stations. And the first station we get to is King's Cross. And King's Cross is part of this transport hub that includes St Pancras International Station and also Euston. And this is what it looks like now, based on an 1800s design that revitalised the appearance of the old King's Cross station. Jack the Kipper. That's another one. Thank you, Mark. But King's Cross is also meant to be the scene of a very famous battle. You always bought the stations. I like that, Janet. The stations were good because you could buy several of them and you would get a decent amount of rent when somebody landed on your stations. Yeah, the stations were good. They were for the tactical player. So King's Cross was also meant to be the scene of Queen Boadicea's massive battle against the Romans, or Boudica, if you prefer the modern spelling of the name. I always knew her as Boadicea. That's the name we were taught when I was at school. But modern historians have said that actually her name was probably Boudica. And she was the one with the spiked chariot. The chariot that you can see on the right with spikes on the wheels in order to mow down her opponents. And she led a revolution against the Roman oppressors. The revolution failed eventually, but this was meant to be the site of one of her main battles as she tried to come into London and take over the city. Now, legend has it that she's buried under King's Cross Station. It's almost certainly not true because no evidence has been found to support that theory. But the theory is that underneath platform 13 at King's Cross, you can find the grave of Boadicea or Boudica. Now that's not true, and equally untrue is the fact that it contains a platform called 9 3/4. This, of course, is from Harry Potter. And there is meant to be, in the books, this is where platform 9 3/4 is meant to be, at King's Cross Station. There is a Harry Potter shop that you can find at King's Cross as well, which is quite exciting and has all sorts of Harry Potter themed merchandise within it. Now along the way I'm going to be posting links. I'm going to post another one in a moment that will show you how you can tip me on the tour through Buy Me a Coffee, and you can also tip me through PayPal. You can find the PayPal details on the group page. There we go. The shop is very expensive. Of course it's expensive, Ziggy. It's a tourist trap. It's bound to be very expensive. But the reason it's called King's Cross is because of George IV, the Prince Regent. Bonnie knows all about the Prince Regent. The Prince Regent was the bad boy of Brighton, the one that built Brighton Pavilion, the one that squandered the nation's money. So he was the one that was memorialised here at King's Cross. A statue was built in honour of King George IV. The trouble was that no one really liked it. And that's because no one really liked the Prince Regent, especially his wife. And so the statue was eventually taken down, but the name remained. So King's Cross is based on the reputation of this rather bad king. King's Cross gained another reputation in the 1980s. It became the hangout of prostitutes. They would gather round King's Cross Station to advertise their wares, ladies of negotiable affection, as they might be known. And this was a place that the police dedicated as a no-go zone in the late 1980s. They knew that prostitution was happening here on a regular basis, but they chose to overlook the fact. And they didn't police it too heavily, so the situation got worse and worse. Nowadays, of course, it's all been revitalised. It's been gentrified. And the whole area of King's Cross looks very different. Hello, Anna. We're just talking about ladies of negotiable affection who used to work the streets of King's Cross. But nowadays, it's all become very much different. And Paddington Basin and the King's Cross Basin, the Regent's Canal that stands behind the station, has all been gentrified. It includes all sorts of amazing shops and businesses and restaurants. And it's a really nice place to go. You prefer the feminist historians. I like feminist historians too. So we're moving on from the stations up to the Blue Zone. It's a little bit more upmarket than the Brown Zone. But because London has developed so much, many of the areas that are considered on this monopoly board to be of low value are now extremely high value. And there's reasons for that. Negotiable affection. It's a good phrase, isn't it? So we're on to the light blue zone. And we're starting off on the Angel Islington, which is now near a very trendy upmarket area called Clerkenwell. And this is now full of wine bars and yoga shops and things like that. As you can tell here, it's all very free range, all very frozen yoghurt. And it's a very expensive place to buy property. But back in the day, back in the 18th century, this was a bit of a wilderness. Now, the reason it's called the Angel Islington is because there was a pub here, and the pub was called the Angel. And the Angel had stood here for a long time, way back until the 17th century. And the Angel was an outpost in what was otherwise pretty much a wilderness. This was an area that you had to travel through in order to get into the more built-up area of London. So you were travelling across heathland, and this heathland was plagued with highwaymen. So if you were lucky enough to reach the Angel Islington unscathed, unrobbed, then you were doing well. Here you can see a picture by William Hogarth, one of the great satirists of the time. Oh, Ziggy. Oh, yes, Rivers of London. Ben Aaronovitch, brilliant series of books. A bit like a cross between Harry Potter and The Bill, which sounds a bit weird, but it's really good. So the Angel became this pub, this tavern, coaching house that stood at the entry point to the City of London. And so this was a haven. This was a place that people would reach with a sigh of relief, because it meant they hadn't been stopped by the highwaymen. Many famous people were accosted by these highwaymen during the 18th and 19th century. And you can see one of them on the right-hand side. This was Dr. Samuel Johnson, the famous lexicographer. He's referred to here as Dr. Syntax, and he was set upon by highwaymen as he was coming down the Angel Islington area. So he was one of the people that was stopped by these highwaymen, by Adam Ant and his companions. Oh, Ziggy, I can tell you're on the same wavelength as me. Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman. Very good. Gives a very alternative view of London. This is what the Angel Islington looks like now. And, of course, it's very upmarket now, redeveloped in Victorian times, but the pub is still there. The pub is underneath this grand building that you can see on the left. Unfortunately, the pub is now a Wetherspoons. Oh dear. Fallen on hard times. J.D. Wetherspoon, by the way, is a chain of pubs that runs all around England and is renowned for, well, I'm not quite sure what it's renowned for. What is a free house? There's a good question, Michelle. A free house means that they've got a licence to sell beer and wine. Exactly, not Wetherspoon. They are generally not great places to go and drink. But that's just my opinion. So the Angel, the pub, is still in the same position it always was. We're moving on through the blues, and actually we've got to a chance card. Now, chance card, you would never be quite sure what you were going to get, whether you would get a reward, whether you would get money, whether you would inherit something from an old aunt that had just died. But in this case, I'll give you an example of a chance. This chance happened in central London, and it happened at the house of Alexander Fleming in 1928. He was a scientist and a chemist, and he was experimenting with different cultures. And to do this, he would leave cultures in Petri trays, Petri dishes, and then he would add various elements to them and see how they reacted. On this occasion, in 1928, he was messing around with different Petri dishes, and he normally put these Petri dishes in the fridge, and then saw what happened to them later on. But on this occasion, he forgot. Not only did he forget, he then went on 2 weeks' holiday. And when he came back after a fortnight, he found the Petri dishes were still there on the side of his lab. And they'd been left all that time. And the hot weather at the time had created some sort of chemical reaction. And the result of this chemical reaction was the invention of penicillin. So this was a really chance occurrence that led to Alexander Fleming discovering penicillin. So there we are, we've taken a chance, and now we're on to the next of the blues. And this is the Euston Road. Now, as I said earlier, this is a real travel hub around King's Cross. You also have St Pancras Station, beautiful station designed by George Gilbert Scott in the late 19th century. And it's also where the British Library is, which is where my darling Olivia works. So, you know, there's another reason that it's so good. But it used to be a market entrance. If you wanted to get to the big markets like Smithfield, then, or Leadenhall, then you would come in down this main road, down the Euston Road. And because of that, people drove their cattle down the middle of the road. So the houses that were built at a certain distance away from the main road, so that they didn't have cattle poo cluttering up their gardens. Oh yes, Siggy, the British Library is amazing. So that's what this used to be, a main wide thoroughfare for cattle to enter the markets of London. But there also used to be another station here called Euston Station, And Euston Station used to look very grand, as you can see in the picture on the left, this great Romanesque entrance into the station. But unfortunately, they destroyed it. The old station stayed there until the 1930s, and then they demolished it, and eventually British Rail got involved. Oh dear. And British Rail decided to reinvent the station as a rather small and boring entrance. So they got rid of this grand building, and all that survives of the original Euston Station is this. Oh, sorry, I've gone too far. Let me go back. The building you can see on the left, and it's got the names of all the destinations that you could go to from Euston Station all around the country. And this is a Victorian building. It's now been changed into a bar. So this is a place where you can go for a quick drink before you catch your train. But you can see on the right-hand side what British Rail did to Euston Station. They made it look positively ugly. And George Gilbert Scott would have turned in his grave. Exactly, Euston Station is horrible. It was criminal to knock it down, but they are planning on a grand refurb. And eventually, Euston Station will look like this. It will be refurbished. It will be made even better. Well, okay. More modern. Maybe not better. But it will at least look better than the British Rail version that went before it. I know, it's not better, but you know, that's progress for you. Anyway, we're moving on to Pentonville Road. Here's what Pentonville Road looks like now, with 5 guys standing at the junction of the main road. This building that you can see in front of you is called the Lighthouse. That's its nickname, and it was used for a rather interesting purpose, which I'll describe in a moment. But this leads me to one of my favourite pictures of London. I love this picture. It's one of the most romantic images of London that you could wish for. And it shows Pentonville Road, one of the main roads leading into the city. Carol Sue, don't worry. I have scaffolding prepared. Don't worry, all is well. It'll be fine. There will be scaffolding at some point. What you can see in the distance is St Pancras Station, towering over everything else. It is a beautiful painting. Now, the building that I talked about earlier, the lighthouse on the far left, it does look like the Houses of Parliament, Ziggy, but that was St Pancras Station, designed by George Gilbert Scott. Now, it's a fair enough mistake to make, because the son of George Gilbert Scott was Giles Gilbert Scott, who also designed, wait for it, the Houses of Commons. There we are. You see, a parliamentary reference. But the building you can see on the left is known as the Lighthouse, and this served a very unusual purpose in the early 1900s. It was a place for fallen ladies of negotiable affection, as I mentioned earlier. And this was a home for ex-prostitutes. The idea was that they would be given education and kind of directed in a different direction. Pentonville Road is also the home of the Castle Pub. And the Castle Pub was where a group of criminals met in the 1990s. And they perpetrated one of the most daring jewel robberies of all time. The thing that made it special was that they were all pensioners. This was the Hatton Garden Jewellery Store robbery, and it was perpetrated by ex-cons who were all in their 60s and 70s, a group of pensioners, criminal pensioners. And because of that, of course, they went to jail. One of the jails they possibly went to was called Pentonville. There's a jail right next to Pentonville Road. It's called Pentonville Prison, as the name might suggest. And here you can see the original design for that prison. Ladies of Horizontal Pleasures. I like that, Joy. Thank you. That's a good one. I'll add that one to my collection. London offers lots of affection. Negotiable affection. So you can see the star design of the prison. And this was the similar design that was used in workhouses at the time. And the idea was to segregate certain elements of criminal society. The men, the women, the murderers, they would be kept on different wings. You went to Pentonville Prison for a concert. That sounds like something that Johnny Cash would perform. A prison concert. Here's another picture of what it looks like. The perspective is rather weird, but it gives you the basic idea. There would be a factory section where the inmates worked. You used to work in there. Wow. That's cool. And also very socially conscious. So this was the early version of Pentonville Prison. But as Linda could probably tell us, it's changed in its design and it's now far more modern, but it's based on that similar original Victorian design. But we're moving on and we've gone to jail. And seeing as we're talking about jails, we're going to carry on. One of the most famous prisons in London was Newgate Prison. And Newgate was the infamous prison that was considered one of the worst in London at the time. Been there since the 12th century in various incarnations. London Sinfonietta. So not Johnny Cash, but something similar. So this was Newgate Prison. Newgate Prison is now the site of the Old Bailey. The Royal Courts of Justice are very nearby. And this is what it looked like back in the 17th century. So this was one of the most notorious prisons called Newgate. There was also another prison in London called Marshalsea. There were several prisons at the time that served different purposes. Marshalsea was a debtor's prison. And this was where you would go if you couldn't pay your bills. And you would end up in prison until you paid your bills or you died. And this was the fate of a man called John Dickens, the father of Charles Dickens. He ended up in Marshalsea, having been unable to pay his debts. And his son Charles Dickens was forced to work at 12 years old in a blacking factory on the banks of the Thames, pasting labels onto tins of boot polish. You've also got various other prisons based on these old Victorian designs, like Wormwood Scrubs, which was the scene of a 1970s TV show called Porridge, a comedy starring Ronnie Barker. But nowadays the prisons are much more modern in appearance. They've been modernised, they've been updated. They now include all sorts of sports fields, as you can see in the middle, somewhere for the inmates to practice sports. But they also refer back to this old Victorian idea of the star-shaped categories. So there we are, we've been in jail, but luckily we have made £50 and we're able to pay to get out of jail free. And we've changed. We've left the dog behind and we've become the top hat. And that's because we're moving into a more affluent area of London. We're onto the pink zone. And the pinks have now become even more affluent. Hello, Bev. Good evening to you. You've joined us in time to go to the posh places of London. And this is Pall Mall. We're onto the pink zone. Now, Pall Mall, as you can see, in the 1980s, was £140 in order to rent a space in Pall Mall. It is now slightly more expensive because Pall Mall is the very centre of London. It's near Trafalgar Square, it's near Soho, it's near Buckingham Palace. So it is an incredibly prestigious area now. And the reason it's called Pall Mall is all because of Charles II. Pall Mall was a cigarette. It was indeed, Michelle. You could get Pall Mall cigarettes. And I'm sure They weren't particularly good for you, but that's what you could get. Now along the way I'm posting links, and I'm posting links to where you can tip me through Buy Me a Coffee. You can also find on my page ways of tipping me through PayPal, and also to join my group if you're not already in my group. Darn, you got visitors. Who's got visitors? Whoever you are, let them join in. Just come and let them join in the discussion. I'm sure they'll enjoy it. They were horrible. There we go. So Pall Mall was named after a sport that was played by Charles II. So when Charles II returned from exile, when he returned to the... Thank you, I deserve lots of coffee. I've already had 3 cups. I won't sleep tonight. That's the way, Bev. Just tell them to go away. When Charles II returned from exile, he came back from France, and he brought with him a game. And this game was called Pall Mall. And this became the modern version of Pall Mall. It was like a long-distance version of croquet, as you can see here. So he's giving the ball a fair old whack, and it's working its way all down this main road. And the main road would eventually become known as Pall Mall. This was also the home of Giovanni Casanova. Now, Casanova, of course, has been indelibly associated with the idea of romantic love, but Casanova wasn't that great. He had a 13-year-old servant, a girl, that he used to make do all sorts of rather perverted things. So Casanova was far from this romantic lover idea that most people have of him. He was actually rather a pervert. So the less said of Casanova, the better. Oh, thank you, Bonnie. I'm glad you're enjoying it. Pall Mall is also the home of various clubs, gentlemen's clubs. I'm afraid it is rather sexist. No ladies are allowed. Even nowadays, no ladies can enter these clubs. Things like White's Club, the Beefsteak Club, the Garrick Club, the Athenaeum, and the Reform Club. And these were all inspirations for P.G. Wodehouse when he came up with the idea of Jeeves and Wooster. And Bertie Wooster spends most of his life at a club called the Drones, which is based in part on some of these private men's clubs. And they're still around today. And they have all sorts of strange traditions, like indoor cricket. So we're moving along the Pinks, and we've got to Whitehall. Now, Whitehall, of course, is very close to where I work, and the prices, as you can see, are going up a little bit. Whitehall is the central road that runs through towards Parliament, and also it used to be the place where a palace was based. And this palace was lived in by Henry VIII. When there was a fire in Parliament in the Palace of Westminster in 1512, Henry VIII moved out, and he moved into Whitehall. And that was where his new palace was based. And this was also where he married Anne Boleyn. And also where he married Jane Seymour. And later got rid of both of them. The palace itself has long since gone because it was burned in a fire in the 1860s. There were a lot of fires around at the time. Reform Club was Phileas Fogg's club. Mark Randall Soho House clubs have an age restriction of 45. There we go. Not only do you have to be male, but you also have to be 45 years old, which is even worse. So even more restricted than normal. So Whitehall Palace burned down, but a lot of the original Victorian buildings still survive. When Oliver Cromwell became the Lord Protector, this was where he had Charles I executed, at the banqueting house on Whitehall itself, which was rather ironic. This was the house that Charles I had created, the huge banqueting mansion that he'd built. and this was inevitably where he would end up dying. He would be executed there after losing the Civil War. Whitehall was also the place where many rich people decided to leave the city during the Great Plague of London. This was in 1665, and Whitehall was one of the main exits and entrances out of the City of London. So many people fled from the Black Death through this area. But nowadays it's the home of all sorts of offices, cabinet offices, government offices. The war rooms are based here, and also there's a rather famous building on Whitehall that you might know. And it is, of course, number 10 Downing Street. So this is where number 10 Downing Street is, the home of the Prime Minister. You can't get very close to it at the moment, unfortunately, because of all the security. Hello, Pamela. Good evening to you. So we're moving on from the Pinks. In our top hat, we're moving to the last of the Pinks, called Northumberland Avenue. And this is a place that used to be filled with hotels. Many of them are still there. It's one of the grand Victorian roads that leads into central London, and because of that it was a prime place to build hotels. And of course, building hotels is what Monopoly's all about. If you've got enough houses, you can then exchange those houses for hotels. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm going mad, building hotels. Celine, how do you pay me for tonight's wonderful tour? Well, there are several ways, but I'm going to post one of them now. You can use Buy Me a Coffee, which is always a pretty reliable way to make a payment. There we are, I've just posted a link, it will show up very soon. So you can buy me a coffee and do it that way. I've probably had enough coffees for the evening, but there we go. We can always use some more. So these hotels that were built on Northumberland Avenue became very famous. 3 of them in particular, the Grand, the Metropole and the Victoria. These were all huge hotels, very advanced technology for the time. They included lifts, for example, elevators that would take you to the different floors. And they would feature in Arthur Conan Doyle's stories of Sherlock Holmes. Several of the hotels in central London feature in his stories, including the Hound of the Baskervilles. This is one of them. I think it was the Grand Hotel, is where Henry Baskerville leaves his shoes outside his hotel door, and his shoes are later taken and used as a scent for the Hound of the Baskervilles itself. But these hotels were monopolised. Ha-ha! There we are. A monopoly in Monopoly. They were monopolised by this man George Frederick, and he owned all 3 of these hotels. Now I'm just wondering, I can see if that last link has come up yet. I'm not sure it has. I don't know if anyone else is seeing that or not. Let me try posting it again. For some reason it doesn't seem to have come up. So I'm going to post this link, how you can tip me through Buy Me a Coffee. Hopefully it will show itself. No link, that's what I thought. Which is rather odd because I am posting links at the moment. Let me try posting them in the chat itself. Let's have a go. Post in event. There we go. Let's try this. Sorry, bear with me. There we go. Let's try that. See how that works. Not seeing any of my links. Okay. I've just posted one, so it should be turning up very soon. Let's see if it works. So we're moving on, past the Pinks, and we've got to another station. And this is Marylebone Station. Or at least that's how most people pronounce it. People that don't live in London. but it's actually called something rather different. Now, I'm rather upset about this. It doesn't seem to be posting this link. And that's rather strange, because I am posting it on the event itself. Now, if one of you lovely people, in the absence of lovely Olivia, if one of you lovely people wouldn't mind going back and copying and pasting that link to buy me a coffee, that would be really helpful. Because for some reason... thank you, Bonnie. I knew I could rely on you. Thank you. So this is Marylebone Station. Except, of course, it's not actually pronounced like that. Marylebone Station, again, is in the heart of London, but the way it's pronounced is like this: Marylebone. And this is one of the things that identifies you as a real Londoner. Either you can pronounce the London names, Leicester Square, Marylebone, or you can't. And in this case, it's pronounced Marylebone. Now, it's nothing to do with Mary I. Many people think it's named after Mary le Bon, French for Mary the Good, but actually it's not. It has quite a different derivation, and it's all to do with the Church of St. Mary. And here you can see the Church of St. Mary in Marylebone, as it's pronounced. Hello, Jen. We're just having a pronunciation lesson here, talking about how to pronounce a certain area of London called Marylebone. Oh, thank you, Bonnie. You're a star. Marylebone. The correct pronunciation, I've been informed, on good advice, is Marylebone. And the reason it's called that is because Mary is St. Mary's Church, and Bone is actually an anglicisation of Bourne, which is an old name for a river. And there was a river that flowed through it. This was one of the branches of the River Fleet, one of the couple of branches of the River Fleet that flowed out into the Thames. And it ran almost underneath this church of St. Mary's. The train station you use to get to London, there we are. It is one of those mainline stations. So Marylebone is the way it should be pronounced. And Marylebone was an area of pleasure. Pleasure gardens were based here in the 18th and 19th century. And these were places, as you can see, that were lined with trees, places, airy spaces where you could enjoy all sorts of illicit activities like gambling and fraternising with women of negotiable affection. It also later became the home of various workhouses, and this was during the late 19th century when the areas around the outskirts of London began to develop into real poverty. Marylebone Fields also became the scene of duels. This was one of the several places around London, like Battersea Park, where you would go to kill someone that you didn't like. If you were a gentleman, that is, you would settle a debt of honour by arranging to meet them at Marylebone Fields, and it was far enough away from the city that you wouldn't get stopped by the peelers, the police of the time. And there you could settle your matter of honour using pistols or swords. We're moving on to the Orange, and the Oranges have got a connection, and you'll understand in a moment what that connection is. This is Bow Street. And again, Bow Street is right in the heart of the city. This is what it looks like nowadays. A very modern, efficient version of Bow Street. It's called Bow Street because apparently it was meant to look like a bow because it was curved. It doesn't actually resemble a bow very much, but that's the reason they gave it its name. And this was one of the early areas of London to be developed in the 18th century, turned into a fashionable estate. But this fashionable estate began to go downhill because right next to it was Covent Garden. The theatres began to spring up all around London. And you know what actors are like. These thespian types, they tend to get up to all sorts of problems. And so it began to damage the reputation of Bow Street. It became an area, for example, for ladies of negotiable affection, because they knew that's where the money was. Covent Garden itself became a hangout for prostitutes. In the 17th, 18th and 19th century, this was the place where ladies of the night, ladies of horizontal pleasure, would gather. So much so that one man wrote a guide to Covent Garden prostitutes, which you can see on the right, Harris's list of the Covent Garden ladies, which included a kind of travel guide of a different sort. They do get around. There were thousands of them in London at the time. But Bow Street also has a magistrates' court, and this was founded by a man called Henry Fielding, an author, a poet, a politician, a member of Parliament. There we go. You see, I've got another parliamentary reference in. And Henry Fielding would form the first real police force, and this was at Bow Street Magistrates' Court. And these people were called the Bow Street Runners. So they became the first police force of London, and they operated out of Bow Street, and they were formed by Henry Fielding. And their job was to travel around London and often around the country catching criminals. They wore very distinctive uniforms, blue uniforms with big top hats, as you can see, and this marked them out as Henry Fielding's personal police force. Celine, that's good to know. It is a bit of a marathon journey, and we're whizzing our way around the board, but we're still on the oranges. We're getting there. We're arriving eventually at the end, quite soon, I hope. So here we are on the next of the oranges. This is Marlborough Street. Marlborough Street contains Liberty's, one of the most famous buildings in London. And this is a beautiful shop. Now, it looks Tudor. You can see the Tudor gables and the Tudor colouring on it. But it's not. It was originally built in the 1840s and then rebuilt in the 1920s in a mock Tudor style. But it's still pretty impressive. And this used to belong to the Duke of Marlborough. He had his own private home here with extensive gardens, and he eventually gave these gardens over to the council at the time in London and said that they could develop them into private squares and streets. And it became the home of fashion. On Marlborough Street, you've got Carnaby Street that leads off from it into Soho, and Carnaby Street in the 1960s was the home of swinging London fashion. It's also the home of Liberty's department store, and there's also a magistrates' court there, Marlborough Street Magistrates' Court. And this was the place where Oscar Wilde would go to accuse the Marquis of Queensberry of slander, saying that he was gay, which obviously clearly wasn't true. It was also the place where Keith Richards would be arrested and charged with, would you believe it, possession of drugs. Now, I know that's difficult for you to believe, Keith Richards being a man of such outstanding reputation and character, but it's true. He was actually at one time charged with possession of drugs, and he was taken to Marlborough Street Magistrates' Court to face that charge. And so was John Lennon, a little bit later. John Lennon also faced similar charges, cannabis possession, I believe. Keith was framed. It wasn't true, Carol Sue. Why would Keith Richards possibly be involved in something like that? So there we go. We've reached the halfway point. We're getting there. Nearly. We've got Vine Street left. Vine Street now looks like this. I know he did snort his father's ashes. I can believe that, sadly enough. What you can see is the modern version of Vine Street, And this was designed by a man called John Nash, one of the great Georgian architects of his time, that also designed the Houses of Parliament, also designed the Buckingham Palace at the time, and the Royal Pavilion at Brighton. And it's also got its own magistrates' court. You can probably see what the connection here is now. And this is where the Marquis of Queensberry came to accuse Oscar Wilde of being gay. And that was because he was having an affair, or had an affair, with his son, called Bosie, Lord Alfred Douglas. And famously, after accusing Oscar Wilde of this, he got into a fight with his son afterwards. And you can see that on the right-hand side. The Marquis of Queensberry, observing Queensberry rules, of course, punching his son in the face. So the connection here is that this is the only group on the Monopoly board that has a common theme. And that theme, of course, is the police. There's a magistrates' court on every one of these streets. And it's not something that people really realise when they're playing it, but there is a very policey theme about the oranges. But we've reached just parking. Now, of course, this says free parking, but in London, as you probably know, there's no such thing as free parking. As you can see, Portman Square car park, 1 hour £10, 24 hours £45. Now this is quite an old picture, but the prices, of course, go up and up. So there is really no such thing as free parking anymore. It's cool to see the difference between American Monopoly and British. That's good. Now we're going to have to go even quicker now because we're only halfway around the board. I'd forgotten how long this tour was. But we can do it. We're on the Strand. And we're getting progressively posher and posher. The Strand is one of the roads that leads along parallel to the River Thames, and because of that it's always been a fairly posh place to go. Here's one of the earliest pictures of the Strand in the 17th century, and it shows the row of houses that even then was considered quite upmarket. But by Victorian times it had become even more so, and some of the grandest mansions in London exist on the Strand itself. These have now mainly been turned into places for governments and high commissions. Australia House is here, one of the scenes of one of the Harry Potter films. So there's all sorts of government commissions and houses along this road. Many of them have long since disappeared. Because it was so fashionable, it's also the home of Twining's Tea, the East Indies company that ruled the tea trade in the 18th and 19th century. And this was a place, a road, where there were many tea houses and coffee houses, which were considered very trendy and fashionable places to be at the moment. There's another pub on the Strand. There are many pubs, but one of them is called the Duck and Drake. And this was meant to be the meeting place of Guy Fawkes and his band of Catholic conspirators. And they had a plan, of course, in 1605 to blow up the Houses of Parliament. And this is the place, the Duck and Drake, where they're said to have had one of their meetings in London to prepare for that momentous event. Oh, something's gone ding. And that, I think, is because the battery on my phone is running out. But that's okay. There we go. And we'll carry on. We're moving on to the red zone. We're coming on to Fleet Street. Fleet Street now is the road that leads up to St Paul's Cathedral, as you can see here. But it was also the home of the River Fleet, one of the most notorious rivers in London that was disgusting. It was used pretty much as an open sewer. You thought that was you. Don't worry, Dawn, that was me. That was my phone telling me that it was running out of battery. This is the course of the River Fleet. It ran all the way from Highgate, leafy Highgate ponds, right down into Blackfriars Bridge. And along the way it became quite disreputable. This was pretty much an open sewer. It was also used in the 1970s film version of Oliver Twist. Charles Dickens based the scene of Fagin's lair at a place called Saffron Hill, just off Fleet Street. And you can see that in the old 1970s film. When they go off on their journeys pickpocketing, the children that you can see here crossing the bridge, they're meant to be crossing the remains of the River Fleet. Thank you, Bev. It's okay. I've got electricity now, I hope. We'll soon find out. So this was the beautiful Fleet Street Church, and many of these churches, like this one, St Jude's, called the Ship of Fleet Street, they still stand on that street. There's also a church called St Dunstan's in the west, that's on Fleet Street, that also has quite a reputation. It was the place where Charles Dickens wrote a Christmas story called The Chimes, a follow-up to A Christmas Carol. And it was also the setting for Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street. In the 1980s, it was the home of the press. There were all sorts of newspaper offices based on Fleet Street that went out of business in the late 1980s, partly because of union disputes and because of Maggie Thatcher's dislike of anything union-related. And you can see one of them here. This is meant to be the original home of Sweeney Todd's barbershop. This is now, or was at the time, the Sunday Post, the People's Friend, the Dundee Journal. So we're on to the last of the Reds, Trafalgar Square. Trafalgar Square, of course, is incredibly famous, and it's one of those places that everyone has to go when they come to London. Trafalgar Square used to look quite different. Back in the 16th and 17th century, this was an entrance that went on eventually to Buckingham Palace, and this was used as a royal mews. Now, mews, at the moment, modern term of mews means somewhere that used to store horses, but originally it was somewhere that stored birds. So, for example, when Henry VIII lived near here, he kept his collection of hunting birds in the mews at Trafalgar Square. Nowadays it's more associated with horses. Mews themselves have become very expensive and desirable properties to live in. But Trafalgar Square would be redesigned, and redesigned by John Nash, the same person that did Regent's Park and Marylebone. There we go, you see. I said Marylebone. Marylebone. And also designed the Brighton Pavilion, the Royal Pavilion that you can see at the top, as well as Buckingham Palace. And this is now owned by the Crown. It's one of those places in London that is actually part of the royal grounds. So this is owned officially by the Crown. You can see the lions that surround Nelson's Column on the bottom right. They were designed by a man called Edwin Landseer. They're known as the Landseer Lions, and they're great for children to sit on. Now, when they did excavations underneath Trafalgar Square in the 1990s, what they discovered were the remains of very old lions, saber-toothed lions. They found the remains of dinosaurs underneath Trafalgar Square, possibly not looking like this. So that's the Reds. We're getting there. We've got to another station. Oh, I've forgotten what station we've got to. Where are we? Oh yes, Fenchurch Street. So there's Fenchurch Street Station. A Brighton Monopoly. Funny, that would be fun. Probably take a little less time than this one. London's a bit bigger. Here you can see Fenchurch Street Station, built in the early 19th century, and a beautiful looking place it is too. There isn't a lot to say about this station except that it was one of the first places to be not just a mainline station serving the rest of the country, but also linked to an underground station. And this was in the early 1830s. But we're on to the yellows. We're getting posher. We're getting more and more expensive. And we're on to Leicester Square. I'm sure that's how it's pronounced. Leicester Square. And as you can see, the rent has gone all the way up from £1 at the Old Kent Road to £260. And this is what Leicester Square looks like now. And it belonged at one time to the Duke of Leicester, hence the name. And the Duke of Leicester had a large house with a private garden. And he allowed the City of London to develop this area, but he said, you've got to keep the bit in the middle, the green bit. This was also the birthplace of one of London's most famous artists, William Hogarth. And it's always been a place of entertainment. In the early 19th century, this was a place that housed what was called the Monster Globe. And this was a huge globe encased in its own building, a bit like the planetarium. And as you could see, you could walk up different levels within the building and get different views of the inside of the globe, as well as the outside from the outside. You pronounce it Leicester Square. OK, Jeanette, I think you're probably right. Maybe it's only Americans that pronounce it Leicester Square. Who knows? So Leicester Square, that is the correct way of pronouncing it, also became very dirty in 1978. This was called the Winter of Discontent, and this was when the unions went on strike all around the country, and they dumped their rubbish in various places, including Leicester Square. And you can see all of the rubbish piled up here in 1978 in the middle of Leicester Square. We're on to the second of the yellows. And this is Coventry Street. Coventry Street was one of these places that housed theatres. It's very near Haymarket, the theatre land of London. And because of that, it was a very famous place. It housed several impressive theatres of the time, and this was where Charlie Chaplin made one of his debuts, also where Rudolph Valentino performed before he was a star in stage and screen, and Noel Coward. They were all associated with this area of Coventry Street. Oh dear, you Brits have tempers, you dirty birds. Oh, that's Stephen King, Misery. So there we are. We've gone on to the waterworks. And one of the most famous waterworks in London is a place called Crossness. It's an old pumping station from Victorian times, designed by a man called Joseph Bazalgette. He designed the embankment that runs along London, and also the modern sewer system, the Victorian sewer system that saved London from an outbreak of typhoid. And this is what it looks like inside. Despite being miles from the centre of London, it's incredibly ornate. It's a beautifully designed building, which is strange because it was designed for no one except the people that worked there. And as Tariq says, it is an amazing place to visit. We're on to the last of the yellows, Piccadilly. Piccadilly, again, is one of those areas of central London that everybody goes to. And one of the main reasons they go there is because the statue of Eros. But Piccadilly started out in the 17th century as a very exclusive place to go. As you can see by the buildings, this was already a posh area by the 17th century. The reason it's called Piccadilly is because this was the name of a type of ruff that was invented at the time. A type of garment that was worn underneath the neck, as modelled by this bearded chap on the right. And it was quite a square ruff, much larger than normal ruffs. So they took the rough with the smooth at the time. And this rough became very popular, and it was called a Piccadilly. So this gave rise to the name of this area. It's also the home of some very posh places like Fortnum and Mason. Fortnum and Mason started off by making candles. They were chandlers. So that was what made their fortune. Back in the 17th century, they began their business by selling candles, very posh candles, to Londoners that could afford them. I know, that was a terrible pun. I do apologise. Striking contrast of the dull ugliness of the generality. Oh, yes. Sorry. He was talking about this statue. In 1892, they created a statue in the middle of Piccadilly. And this statue was called Eros. But actually it's become known as Eros. But the actual statue itself is of another god completely. This is actually a statue of Anteros. Piccadilly is indeed known for its entertainment. This was originally called the Shaftesbury Memorial Fountain. That was the idea. So there was a fountain that used to spout water up over this statue. But although many people call it the statue of Eros, and it's one of the famous places to meet in London, a place where if you wait, they say you will meet eventually everyone in the world by standing at Piccadilly Circus, it's actually a statue of Anteros. And Anteros was a kind of relative of Eros. Eros was the god of passion, the god of love, but Anteros was the god of sex, the god of raw animal passion, which is much more fun, I think, than the god of courtly love, who was Eros. So actually this is a very sexy statue. That's what I think anyway. Now we've changed, we're on the racing car, and that's because we're on a race. We're going through Regent Street. Again, designed by John Nash, the man that built the Houses of Parliament. And this started off as quite a downtrodden, down-at-heel area, and that's because it was rebuilt after the Great Fire of London in 1666. And all the slums and terrible housing that existed got burnt as well, and that paved the way for all sorts of new buildings. And so it was redesigned by John Nash. He got around. He designed a lot of London. And then later in the 1930s by a man called Norman Shaw, who rebuilt the area to make it even more fashionable. It's the home of Hamleys, the famous toy shop, the most famous toy shop in the world. Hamleys started off in the in the late 19th century, and it started off making its fortune selling table tennis tables, ping pong tables. As you can see here, they were originally covered with green felt to make them look like real tennis courts. So that's Regent Street. And we're on to Oxford Street. Oxford Street, of course, is the main shopping area now in London, and it's one of the oldest streets in London. This used to be the Via Londinium back in Roman times, one of the main areas that led into the city. It's also part of the route that leads to the Tyburn Tree. Ping pong called Whiff Waff. I'm going to take your word for that, Siggy. I think Whiff Waff is a much better name than ping pong. Both quite onomatopoeic names. So this was originally the road that led to the Tyburn Tree. This was the execution place in London for many centuries. And the road that led there was down Oxford Street. The Tyburn Tree itself was a scaffold that was erected outside the City of London, called the Nevergreen Tree. There was a bit of a pun on its name. And this was where many hundreds of convicted felons would meet their end. Oh, as you can see, in this picture by William Hogarth, whenever there was a local execution in London, there was a bit of a bank holiday atmosphere, and hundreds of people, thousands of people would turn out along Oxford Street to watch the procession of the doomed miscreant. But this area was also a rookery. There's a place called St Giles Fields, very near to it. And this was an area of the worst poverty and the worst crime back in Victorian times. One of the areas that Charles Dickens knew very well. No Netflix in those days. Indeed, there wasn't, Bunny. But eventually it was upgraded, it was gentrified, and it was turned into the shopping street it is now, with its grand Victorian mansions. But it's still a pretty dodgy place to visit, because it has the highest crime rate in central London. And that's because there's lots of pickpockets here, lots of illicit sweet shops breaking various rules, American candy stores that are kind of tax dodges, and there's all sorts of criminality that goes on Oxford Street. It's a bit like the Ramblers in Spain, a place where you should always put your wallet in your front pocket. So that's Oxford Street, and this is what it looked like during the pandemic, by the way. This is one of the pictures from the pandemic when Oxford Street was incredibly empty, and I actually cycled up it at the time, and I can confirm how empty it was. We're moving on to the last of the greens, which is Bond Street. Bond Street is even more posh than Oxford Street. Oxford Street is where the grand department stores are, but along Bond Street you'll find all sorts of quality shops. And it's been that way for a long time, since the 18th century. That's because this was an area where the rich and famous people would hang out. They wouldn't actually buy anything, they would simply walk along this street. There was New Bond Street and Old Bond Street. This is the only place in London where you have two places with the same name, Old Bond Street and New Bond Street. In the middle, of course, there was another one called James Bond Street. Sorry, I'm hallucinating at this point. This is a satire by Thomas Rowlandson, and it shows these very posh people walking down Bond Street just to get noticed. This was the place where you would come to parade your new clothes and get yourself noticed in society. And now it's the home of all sorts of amazing and very expensive shops, like Cartier and Chanel, and various other emporiums like those. We're on to a last station, which is Liverpool Street Station. And this is what it looks like now. It's been upgraded and redeveloped over the last 15 years, turned into a transport hub, one of the places that Crossrail was developed, the Elizabeth line. But while they were digging out the foundations for this new line, they found layers of history underneath, and you can see some of them here. The Victorian foundations, Bedlam burial grounds, the old psychiatric hospital that stood here, medieval Moorfield Marsh, Roman suburbs. So while they were digging the foundations for the Elizabeth line, they found all of this history underneath the city. And this was the site of the first Bethlehem Hospital, which later became known as Bedlam. Bonnie, you're a star. Thank you very much for posting that. You can see the skeletons they found underneath the station itself. Some of these skeletons had died in the Great Plague. Many more had been buried here in unmarked graves from Bethlehem Hospital. Liverpool Street was also bombed in the First World War. Not the Second World War, but the First World War. This was a Zeppelin attack from Germany, and the Zeppelins went over London and bombed the city. It's something that we don't really talk about very much, but it definitely happened. And these Zeppelins dropped bombs on central London. One of the places the bombs hit was Liverpool Street Station. Liverpool Street is also famous for being one of the places that was involved in the Kindertransport scheme. So this was where the British decided to try and rescue hundreds of thousands of children from Germany. And the way that they did that was by smuggling them out of the country in the 1930s, before the war started. And they knew that the Jewish children were being persecuted, so they found various ways of getting them out of the country. And one of the places they came to was Liverpool Street Station, as you can see by the statue on the right that commemorates the Kindertransport evacuation scheme. Here we are. We're nearly there. We're on the blues. We've got to the most expensive places on the board. And this is Park Lane. And Park Lane has, for many hundreds of years, been a very affluent part of London. The Doodlebugs. Thank you, Bonnie. They were called the Doodlebugs because they made a certain noise as they approached. These were radio-controlled bombs that were launched from Germany. So, certainly since the 17th century, this has been an increasingly affluent part of London. And this, of course, is where you will now find Marble Arch. Marble Arch used to stand outside Buckingham Palace. It was the home of Benjamin Disraeli, one of Britain's greatest prime ministers. So this was a very important and affluent area. Next to it is Hyde Park, which contains Speaker's Corner. And this is where people like Karl Marx and George Bernard Shaw have made speeches. That's one of the tours that I'm going to be doing a bit later, by the way, taking you on a walk through Hyde Park. And we'll be travelling all the way from Speaker's Corner to the Albert Memorial on the other side of the park. But it's also a place of extremely expensive hotels. And for those that are staying in those hotels, they might also want some transport to get around London. So this is the home of BMW Park Lane, Aston Martin, the James Bond cars, named after Bond Street. And as you can see, many of these supercars end up getting parked outside these amazing hotels like the Dorchester, which gives you an idea of how rich the people are that live there. And we're on to our last of the squares, Mayfair. You lived in a flat at Lancaster Gate. Very posh, Bonnie. Here's Mayfair. And Mayfair has gone all the way up to £2,000 with a hotel, which is a far cry from the cheapness of Old Kent Road. Mayfair is nowadays very affluent, one of the greatest areas of real estate in the country, but it started off as rather a down-at-heel place. It was the home of an annual event called, you guessed it, the May Fair. And as Bonnie said, it was pretty much a red light district. This May Fair took place for hundreds of years, and this was almost a pagan festival celebrating the rights of May. People dancing round the maypole, as you can see on the left. And it was also a place where you could get anything that you wanted. You could sell your wife, for instance, in Mayfair. You could get married very quickly. These were called fleet marriages, marriages that took place near the source of the River Fleet. And you could engage in all sorts of illicit activities. So the May Fair was this raunchy event that took place over hundreds of years. These were some of the churches that you can still find in Mayfair, where these quickie weddings used to take place. Queen Anne was informed about the Mayfair, but nobody actually told her the truth about what went on there, because they were worried that Queen Anne might be offended by the activities of the Mayfair, so she never closed it down. It turned into something called the Shepherd's Market in the 1930s, which kind of reformed it a bit and made it a bit more acceptable. And you can still find the old Shepherd's Market, the old Shepherd's Street, at the entrance to Mayfair itself. But Mayfair nowadays is best known as the place where many famous people have stayed or lived, including Winston Churchill, Florence Nightingale, Beau Brummell, the man who made the clothes for the Prince Regent, and Jimi Hendrix. Rather a disparate bunch, but they've all stayed or lived at one time in Mayfair. As you might expect, the prices in Mayfair are a little in the expensive range. Here we go. I've looked on the estate agent's list to give you an idea. A 2-bedroom flat for rent in Curzon Square, only £2,100 a week. Or if you want to buy, a 3-bedroom flat for sale is only £9,750,000. Cheap at half the price. House, you can have your own Rome Park, which contains Speaker's Corner. And this is where people like Karl Marx took place over hundreds of years. These were some of the churches that you can still find in Mayfair, where these quickie weddings used to take place. Queen Anne was informed about the Mayfair, but nobody actually told her the truth about what went on there, because they were worried that Queen Anne might be offended by the activities of the Mayfair, so she never closed it down. It turned into something called the Shepherd's Market in the 1930s, which kind of reformed it a bit and made it a bit more acceptable. And you can still find the old Shepherd's Market, the old Shepherd's Street, at the entrance to Mayfair itself. But Mayfair nowadays is best known as the place where many famous people have stayed or lived, including Winston Churchill, Florence Nightingale, Beau Brummell, the man who made the clothes for the Prince Regent, and Jimi Hendrix. Rather a disparate bunch, but they've all stayed or lived at one time in Mayfair. As you might expect, the prices in Mayfair are a little in the expensive range. Here we go. I've looked on the estate agent's list to give you an idea. A 2-bedroom flat for rent in Curzon Square, only £2,100 a week. Or if you want to buy, a 3-bedroom flat for sale is only £9,750,000. Cheap at half the price. Now here's a little TikTok video that I made some years ago that shows you the cheapest property you can buy in Mayfair. I added some cool music to it as well. If you don't mind sharing with a mouse, you can have your own Rome in Mayfair, number 5 Lamb Street. Here it is. And there's the mouse. You can see right next to it. So that is the cheapest property in Mayfair. That's one of the only TikTok videos I've ever made. Oh, as you can see, I built hotels all around the board. I thought I might as well, seeing as I've made so much money. And of course, in order to build those hotels, there is one thing that I require in abundance. Are you ready, Carol Sue? We have to have scaffolding. And that, of course, makes my tour complete. So, thank you all very much, ladies and gentlemen. It took me a little longer than expected, but we got there. We got round the board in record time. Thank you all very much for coming. There we are, Carol Sue. You've got your scaffolding. What more can you ask for? Thank you all very much, and Bonnie, thank you for your sterling work. That's very kind of you. Thank you all for coming. I look forward to seeing you on more of my tours in the future. I've got live tours coming up, travelling across Hyde Park, all sorts of stuff going on. If you're not already a member of my group, then why not? Join my group and you can find out about all the tours that I've coming up in the future. But for now, thank you all very much for coming. I wish you all a good evening, and I wish you success in any future games of Monopoly that you might play. Thank you.